Good evening. I am Bee Fear, and on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Martha's Vineyard, I'd like to welcome you to our virtual candidate forum for Aquinnah. Typically, as you know, the forums are held for all candidates running for a public office, contested and non-contested. But this is not a typical time with COVID, and due to the constraints of the Zoom format, we're talking only with candidates for contested races. Unfortunately, 2 candidates for the planning board are unavailable. So this evening, I will be talking only with the candidates for Board of Health. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization and has as its mission to improve our systems of government and impact public policies through citizen education and advocacy. It neither supports nor opposes candidates for office at any level of government. I want to remind the viewers that the Aquinnah Town Meeting is coming up on May 10, and the election is on May 12. And you'll have not only candidates, but you'll also have some ballot questions on your election. I have with me tonight Gerald Green, who is running for re-election, and James Glavin, who is a former member of the board. Each will start with a 5-minute introduction, and then I will ask some questions that have been suggested by members of the public. Dr. Green, would you like to go first and start us off, please? And you have to unmute yourself, Dr. Green.
Yep, I'm aware. Thank you. Thank you very much, Bee and Jim, and Lucy is somewhere in the background. I am an incumbent, have been on the board for 3 years. I have never missed a meeting. I have been an active member of this board, and as a private citizen, I have been a formal and informal resource to the members of the select board in areas related to the COVID pandemic. The reason I spoke to the select board as a private citizen was that the chair of the Board of Health, who is now my opponent, would typically not entertain Board of Health motions that related to recommendations to the select board, which seemed quite contrary to our mandated responsibility, given the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic, and with the select board not getting any formal advice from the Board of Health that I was involved with. I am a retired pulmonary physician, practicing in Massachusetts for more than 40 years. During that time, I was a consultant to the Massachusetts Department of Public Health for tuberculosis control, with deep understanding of respiratory issues, such as tuberculosis, and consistent with COVID and other public health issues. I represent Aquinnah in a multi-year Massachusetts state grant, which was recently awarded, providing more robust services to our town, as well as the islands and Nantucket, related to tick control, food safety, public health, all of which are of interest to our board, as well as to the larger island community. I have been an Aquinnah seasonal resident since 1989, a full-time resident and voter since 2018, and I was appointed to be a member of the All Island Climate Action Group, representing Aquinnah on the Public Health and Safety Working Group. I also volunteer as a shellfish warden in Aquinnah, and as a retired person, I have plenty of time to commit to Aquinnah and would like to make a contribution to this wonderful town. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Glavin, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, indeed. For those who may not know me, I've lived in town for nigh on 40 years, been on island for well over 50, full-time working here. I've run several reasonably successful businesses, and I have a very good knowledge of the town, of the workings of the island, of the people here, especially the working people. And that gives me a perspective, I think, that's necessary for this particular position, or probably any position in local government. I respect Dr. Green. I've worked with Dr. Green through a few years, I guess. And my only problem is that he is a part-time resident. And my opinion is that that doesn't allow a full perspective of what island life is about, and the issues that really affect islanders, working islanders, and whatnot. Perhaps he has a better perspective on the transient, or the, if you will, tourist, or at least seasonal residents. But on the other hand, where the rubber meets the road here, as far as I'm concerned, is the year-round community. It's what sustains the place and what keeps it going, at least physically, if not financially. My aim is to advocate for things that are of benefit to our town. At times, there are conflicts between what may benefit the Down Island towns and our town. One of which Dr. Green did allude to, this off-island proposal that it came across my purview while I was on the board, and I guess is in process of being approved. There are two sides to that coin. It promises much, but there are certain portents that it brings with it that have not really received the proper vetting, in my humble opinion. Whether the proposal should be accepted or not, at this point, I don't have an opinion. All I know is that the vetting process was very one-sided, and I think deserves further examination. So it's not quite as rosy as Dr. Green presented it, in my opinion. I have been on the board. My work experience, my professional experience gives me a very good perspective on what seems to be the largest work of the board, namely septic systems. I'm very familiar with their design, implementation, functionality, and whatnot. Water quality, wells, soils, geology also is something that I can say is very familiar to me. The main work of the Board of Health is preserving public health, of course. And I believe public health is a larger issue than I don't have a rehearsed spiel here, so bear with me. I'm not a, but I think we had a unique opportunity, or we certainly presented some unique opportunities to the town during the recent COVID stuff, in that initially, when the thing arose, testing was a real problem. I canvassed every doctor I knew on island, and all seemed to agree that it was a problem. Most of them having sent people to the hospital for a test to find out what's wrong with them, only to have them turned away. As a response to that, we were the first to bring test kits to the island, which we made available to anybody, well, practically anybody, but certainly everybody in town at no cost, either to the user and at no cost to the town. We were reimbursed by FEMA. I am really not familiar with Dr. Green's allegation that I was unresponsive or blocked. I don't remember exactly what he said, but interface with the board of Selectmen. The powers of dealing with public health resides actually solely with the Board of Health. Certainly the Board of Selectmen support was never not sought or turned down in any way, but the power to actually regulate things does reside with the Board of Health. And I'm very surprised to hear this from Dr. Green. It's news to me. I was there. Dr. Green wasn't there. He was on the other side of the country, and maybe his experience of the meetings he did participate in remotely was not the same as the people who were at the meeting. I don't know. All I have to say is that accusation, if it is an accusation, it certainly sounded like one, to my knowledge, is unfounded. In closing, I've raised my 5 kids in town. I've worked, played, and been a town person for quite a while, full time, all the time. I truly do love and respect the town and its people. And my goal is to bring common sense and an intellectual curiosity to the questions that we face on the Board of Health. And I feel that I do offer the voters a choice, both between me being a full-time resident and also advocating for regulation only when it's absolutely necessary. I believe in personal responsibility, and I believe we need to respect that responsibility and preserve the freedoms we have, which in many ways have been put in jeopardy in the last couple of years. I thank you, Ms. Fear, and everybody who's listening for hearing me.
Well, let's jump off from that question about personal responsibility, because one of the issues that is definitely in the eyes of the public right now has to do with mask wearing. And I would like to know your opinion about whether or not there should be a regulation about mask wearing, or whether there should be a recommendation, and if so, what that recommendation would be. Mr. Glavin, why don't you start on that one?
I'm certainly not going to get into a debate of the efficacy of masks. It is a moot point. I think that at least can be agreed to. I certainly respect anyone who wishes to wear a mask. I respect anyone who is interfacing, I mean, direct with me personally or whatever, to if we're requested to wear one. On the other hand, I think the efficacy of masks is enough in question that mandating it in all circumstances, especially outdoors, is unfounded. This is a moot point. I recognize the debate. I think the debate is still going on. Obviously, most of the restrictions have been relaxed, so that said something to at least the need for them at the present time. But my overall opinion is that this is an area of personal responsibility. If you feel threatened, by all means, take every precaution you wish. On the other hand, to require that everyone hides behind the thing is detrimental in many ways to society. I do believe that having children masked, who are the least vulnerable segment of the population to this particular malady, is wrong. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you. Dr. Green, do you have a comment on masks?
Well, I think I would agree with Jim that it is somewhat a moot point, given the fact that we are at a certain curve in the pandemic. So the purpose of a mask now is not the same as as the reason for a mask a year or two ago. I think that there's, and I think if you look at medical information in the last 48 hours in the New York Times, they've asked all of the mask experts and public health people about masks, and most of the time masks are not necessary now. There may be a time when it will need to be reinforced, but in particular, the point about masking is that you're not wearing a mask just for yourself, you're wearing it for the community around you. So if the people around you are at risk because they're immunocompromised or they're older than a certain age, then I think that it's perfectly appropriate to wear a mask. And I'm surely continuing to wear a mask in public settings where social distancing cannot be maintained. But again, I think the issue of mandating masks at this moment is, and I agree with Jim, a moot point, but I think each person has to look at not only themselves and their own personal risk, but the risk of greater community around yourself to make sure that you're doing the right thing for yourself as well as the surrounding community. Personally, I'm going to be coming back to Aquinnah next week. I'll be wearing a mask on the airplane, and I think that makes perfect sense.
Thank you. So the Board of Health has a variety of different roles, and I'd like to ask you each to comment on what your very top priority for the next year would be that the Board of Health address. Dr. Green, what would be your top priority for the next year in office?
Well, I think that many people who might be listening are not aware that the boards of health around the state have a mandate to do certain things, but we don't receive any funding for any of those. And this is, Massachusetts is unique in that regard. So we in Aquinnah are dealing with a small community, and we have a very limited budget as a result. We have a very part-time worker, and it's very difficult to achieve all of the goals other than the typical mandated goals that Jim pointed out, which have to do with water quality and septic systems, that kind of thing. We have a potential catastrophe going on because of climate change, and our town surely does not have the resources to deal with the impact of climate change in Aquinnah. And fortunately, by virtue of the state grant that has been, is already in place now, it has been fully vetted. It does provide extra personnel to our community related to ticks, food safety, and public health, which will only enhance what we can provide to the community. In terms of the impact of climate change on our island, not just our community, we are involved in an island-wide collaboration, and I think that Aquinnah's involvement in that collaboration will only help us as we deal with the changes in ecology of vectors, allergens, water quality with algae blooms. You might be aware that we had a problem with that in Squibnocket last year with cyanobacterium, food and water safety. So there are a number of issues that all island collaboration can only strengthen what we do in Aquinnah. From my standpoint,
am I hearing you saying that your top priorities are issues around climate change for the next year?
No, my top priorities are to do what we're mandated to do. And I think that that will eventually expand with our grant process and with our Island Collaboration Climate Action Network into enhancing the climate change issues that we must address as well.
Thank you. Mr. Glavin, do you have a top priority for your first year in office for next year if you're elected?
I would think our top priority, well, is doing our job, but that goes without saying. As Dr. Green mentioned, septic systems and water quality and whatnot. But I think water quality is a very real issue that does need monitoring and attention where it's appropriate. The algae bloom he mentions is typical of that. This is something that in some cases it's very hard to address, but it's something that certainly affects us in all venues, both in terms of fisheries and just having clean water to drink and whatnot. Water issues, luckily for us, water availability issues and whatnot is a worldwide problem. Luckily for us, we seem to be in no danger on that score. But those are the type of issues I believe we need to definitely keep our fingers on.
Do you think the town should have any ban on any pesticides or herbicides looking at water quality? And
well, pesticides are, there was a regulation process that went through a year or three ago involving licensing and the handling, to make sure that the handling of these chemicals are done properly by informed people. Pesticides, I can't say blanket that pesticides should be banned. In some cases, that is appropriate. I think the best way to approach that is to rely on professionals who know what they're doing and use them in the ways that are actually beneficial. Certainly overuse can be a problem. Nearby water bodies can be a problem. But I think we have to depend on our professional community to educate themselves about this, which that regulatory process was addressed to. And I think that answers your question.
Thank you. Dr. Green, do you have anything to say about herbicides and pesticides in terms of the town's role?
Yeah, I agree with what Jim said. I think that he's referring to a landscaping policy that was promulgated a number of years ago, and which had to do with educating and limiting the various herbicides that might be placed on lawns. And what I don't know is how well that's being monitored and enforced. And I think that in general, every town falls short in the enforcement piece of some policies that are out there. So I'm just not aware of what is happening in Aquinnah. I know there are some, that most of our land is wild, but there are areas where people have obviously planted with a lot of chemicals, and ultimately, depending on the location of their site, there could be implications. And this is what we deal with routinely in the Board of Health when we look at septic systems and leaching fields and wetlands and trying to determine the plume for where any runoff might affect our largest water body, which is Squibnocket Pond, where there's very little motion back and forth because of the small channel into the pond.
Thank you. Let's talk about ticks. Mr. Glavin, what do you think the Board of Health should be doing about ticks? Are they an issue for Aquinnah? And
they're an issue. They're an issue for all of us. I don't think I know anyone who hasn't had some sort of adverse reaction from the darn things. This is a problem that probably is not going to go away. On the other hand, every effort, reasonable effort, should be taken to try to control the things. A couple of years ago, I believe it was before Dr. Green was on the board, there was a proposal from some folks from MIT. We jokingly called it making bionic mice, because the white mouse is a definite vector in terms of the development of ticks. That seemed to peter out, unfortunately. It was interesting. Whether it had any veracity, it's hard to tell. Obviously, it didn't happen. But innovative ideas like that would be wonderful. Spraying, I know in some cases people do. I don't know how good that is. I see the oh dear trucks driving around, who I don't know those guys, but I know a lot of people who have had very adverse reactions and have actually built barriers around their land. But the short answer to your question is yes, it's a big problem. I don't have a magic solution for it. Do I think the board should keep its finger on the pulse of anything that's developing in that regard? Absolutely. It's probably the biggest local problem we have that threatens our public health, in my humble opinion.
And Dr. Green, you mentioned a grant that is giving the town some funding in terms of ticks. Could you talk a little bit more about that and what you think the town should be doing? You're still muted. Uh-oh, I think Dr. Green is frozen.
Oh my gosh.
Lucy, can you do anything about that?
Unfortunately, no.
Hey, Dr. Green, if you can hear us, maybe you could log off and then try to come back in again. Oh dear. I don't know if he can hear us or not.
No, he's just frozen.
Someday we will be doing this in person again, and we will not have to be dealing with these technical issues.
And the sooner the better.
And the sooner the better. Now he's gone off, so that's promising. And he'll probably.
I hope California didn't fall off.
Now, next year in town hall, we'll be.
We can throw tomatoes at each other, huh?
We can be doing it live. Yeah. Lucy, can you see him trying to come in the waiting room?
Not yet, but I'm keeping my eye out. As soon as he shows up, I'll let him back in and then rearrange the screen.
Okay, I just want to let the viewing audience know who's watching this. Lucy Morrison is working behind the scenes with as our technical support person.
Oh, here he comes. He's still mute.
You're back.
Okay, sorry. This is challenging. I have no idea why I lost a connection. In terms of ticks, at the meeting last week of the Island Board of Health that I represent Aquinnah on, the person who was hired by this new grant to be our tick person just had identified his first nymph tick of the season. This man is a ecologist who has special training, and he's going to enhance what's available on the island as well as to us should we want to use him. My understanding about the mice and the experimental mice is, I think in the Boston Globe this week, it mentioned that actually they have been released in Nantucket. So I think that it's actually happening in fact.
And you've muted again.
As you know, the Lone Star tick does not require mice as the intermediary, and Aquinnah and Chappaquiddick are now infested with the Lone Star tick. So we have a lot of work to do. The most important thing is education, which is available through the Board of Health, and personal protection, and treating your clothes with permethrin, standard things. I check myself every day after working in the garden, and obviously that makes good sense. And I think that those remedies are available, and that information is available on the Board of Health website.
Thank you. And I'm gonna stick with you, Dr. Green, while we still got you, but in case we lose you again. I wanted to ask you, what else needs to be done to protect our waters? We were talking about that, and we talked about herbicides and pesticides. What are you implementing or requiring any special septic systems near water?
At the moment, we are not. We are very sensitive to that issue. We know that there are some efforts being done in the lagoon area about permeable barriers and denitrification. But at this point, these are all in a somewhat exploratory mode, and the Board of Health at this point we are not going to recommend any of these systems until they are widely analyzed and have gone through an approval process. So the towns that are closer to the lagoon right now have some sites that they're doing research on, and we assume that at some point there will be more information available to all of us.
Would you be open to requiring special nitrogen denitrification septic systems if they found to be beneficial?
Yeah, we've already discussed that in our Board of Health this year. And again, we think it's probably premature, but we need to do the analysis. And at some point, I suspect that we'll have a different set of recommendations. But at this point, we are very sensitive to anyone who is near a water body or wetland, and try to work with the engineers to minimize the impact of nitrogen.
Mr. Glavin, how do you feel about requiring denitrification systems?
Well, comparing it to the situation at the lagoon, the soils in Aquinnah are extremely variegated. It's a geological fact that the North Shore, but especially Aquinnah, so the soil conditions vary greatly from spot to spot. I mean, within feet of one another, it could be night and day. This makes such a decision a little more complicated, because what might be appropriate at your neighbor's house may be totally inappropriate for you. In that sense, my gut feeling is any sort of blanket regulation in that regard is very premature. But if it did become appropriate in certain areas, because we have wetlands everywhere, there's no question about that, and watercourses. If it became necessary, I think it would have to be done on a case-by-case basis, which is a daunting thing. But it's certainly at this stage of the game, it's probably what would be required before such action could be justified.
Thank you very much. I've run out of my prepared questions. I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond to one another. I understand that there was a suggestion, Dr. Green, that you're not available because you're out of town a great deal. Would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, I can tell you that last year I was away from Aquinnah for 2 months. And I think that that's not inconsistent with many people in the town of Aquinnah. who are retired and have other responsibilities outside Aquinnah.
Thank you. And similarly, Dr. Green, you said something about Mr. Glavin's reluctance to communicate properly with the Board of Selectmen. I wasn't totally clear on what you were alluding to. Could you clarify that and we'll give Mr. Glavin a chance to respond?
Well, I think that when COVID was on the upsurge and people were contacting the Board of Health and the selectmen and the janitor and anyone else they could, it was clear that the Board of Selectmen would benefit from input and direction from the Board of Health. We were dealing with a 100-year unusual pandemic, and I thought that it would be helpful if there was a more collaborative approach with the select board, who was also making decisions about the shops and town hall. And when I offered motions at our meeting to try to come up with a plan that could be presented for help to the people who were making individual decisions in town hall, I was generally rebuffed. So as a result, I went to the the select board myself as a private citizen and made specific recommendations, as well as had an ongoing dialogue via email with various members of the select board in order to make them feel supported while they were dealing with a raft of issues in town hall and from people in town. I did not feel that the Board of Health was presenting a unified approach which would document leadership and ownership of this issue.
Thank you. Mr. Glavin, would you like to respond to that?
I will take particular exception to that entire statement. If Dr. Green was rebuffed at a meeting, it's news to me. As chairman, it is not my ability to second any motion that might have been made, but I know of no motion, or at least off the top of my head, I know of no motion that Dr. Green made in the regards he's talking to at all. If he approached the Board of Selectmen, he did it, as he said, as a private citizen, but he also did it without consulting with us, the rest of the board, or our health agent, all of whom were very much engaged in the entire issue of COVID. Again, we provided test kits, which was the response. We received no communication from the Board of Health, from the Board of Selectmen. I attended several Board of Selectmen meetings where they inquired, mostly Jim Newman inquired about various issues, all of which, to my knowledge, were answered to his satisfaction. So whatever this perception, whatever this problem may be that Dr. Green is alluding to, it may be a perception problem because he was 3,000 miles away. I really don't know what to say.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to just ask you to sum up why you should be elected, and maybe you can plug in there what public health issues keep you awake at night, and why we should pick you, or not we. I'm not a Aquinnah voter, but why the voters of Aquinnah should vote for you. And Mr. Glavin, you want to go first?
As you wish. What I have to offer is I'm a full-time resident I'm engaged in the island, not just as a visitor, not just as a retiree, nothing against retirees for sure. But it gives me a perspective, I think, that allows me to understand the view of workers. For instance, in the beginning of COVID, there was a construction shutdown. That did not happen in Aquinnah. We had monitoring, we had a plan to deal with construction sites in town, but we required no one to stay home unreasonably. No working people were burdened. In many places, it was 3 months when people who live hand to mouth weren't allowed to work. And I mean, you have a situation where you have a carpenter putting up trim in a house all by himself, and he can't go to work. He can't earn a living. This is a serious burden for many people on the island, and it's a perspective that may be lost on many people on the island. And I think it's an important perspective that needs to be aired. I am one who shies away from regulation unless it's absolutely necessary. Obviously, we can't live in a world without rules. But I think any regulation, before it's mandated, before it's imposed, before it takes away people's freedom, needs to be vetted very, very carefully. And
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dr. Green, you have closing remarks about why you should be reelected?
Thank you. Thanks for hosting this event. I emphasize the fact that having a physician on the Board of Health can only make that board stronger. During my more than 40 years as a Massachusetts physician involved with patient care and public health matters, and as a board member in other nonprofits, I have always tried to be a problem solver and treated everyone from the outside with respect. Our present Board of Health with a new chair is functioning well, and I see no compelling reason to change its present makeup, but democracy allows such changes to occur, and I respect. I can only reiterate that I leave my ego at the door during all meetings, and I will continue to treat all petitioners and visitors with dignity and respect, and will continue to protect the fragile land known as Aquinnah and the health of its population as best I can. I have been involved as a collaborative individual with a liaison to the island healthcare for all of the COVID supplies that came to Aquinnah. I've promoted the grant that has allowed boosting of personnel to improve the quality of public health on the island that is available for Aquinnah's use whenever we would want. And I've been involved in the Public Health Safety and Planning Group for the Climate Action Committee. I have tried to remain collaborative and caring about the land and the people in the community that I love. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you, anybody want to raise your hand for an opportunity to say something you forgot to say? Nope. In that case, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the viewers. Thank you to the candidates. And thank you to the voters. And remember, your town meeting is on May 10 and your election is on May 12. And good night and goodbye.